The chain around cabin 12 had been wrapped 3 times through the door handle and padlocked to an eye bolt sunk into the frame. Rebecca Collins braced her foot against the doorpost, wedged the pry bar into the lock, and pulled. The eye bolt gave with a small, mean sound. The chain fell in a heap on the porch. She was 47 years old. She had bought this abandoned resort in northern Michigan 3 weeks ago, out of a foreclosure listing at 2 in the morning, with almost every dollar she had left in the world. According to the county, Silver Pine had 11 cabins. She was standing in front of the 12th. The postcard from 1988 was folded in her coat pocket, pressed against her ribs like a small, insistent hand. Inside the cabin, a woman's wool coat still hung on a hook beside the door. A coffee cup with a red flower rim sat on the table. The clock on the wall had stopped at 2:17. Nobody, Rebecca thought, walks away from a place forever and leaves a coat on the hook. She stepped inside. The coffee was still warm when Michael told her about the other woman. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where they had eaten breakfast for 17 years. And Rebecca Collins would remember, later, that Michael had lowered his voice as if a soft tone could change the sentence itself. There was someone else. 8 months. He was sorry. He had not planned it. He offered all the things people offer when they are trying to make the ending sound gentler than the beginning had been. Rebecca did not scream. She did not throw the mug. She looked down at the coffee between them and thought, absurdly, that she had made it too strong that morning. 22 years of Tuesday mornings. And this one was going to be the one that divided her life into 2 parts. Before, after. She asked how long. 8 months, he repeated. She corrected him. She meant how long had he been leaving. He didn't answer. He looked at his hands, then the window, then the wall behind her, and never once at her face. And Rebecca thought that might have been the cruelest part of the morning. He had stopped seeing her some time ago, and she had not noticed. The divorce moved quickly after that. Michael's attorney was already prepared. Rebecca hired one because a friend told her she had to, not because she believed there was anything left worth fighting for. The Michigan house went on the market and sold in 11 days to a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever. And Rebecca watched from the kitchen window as the woman stood in the yard and pointed out where a swing set could go. The savings were divided in a way that felt fair on paper and unfair everywhere else. The furniture that had once been chosen together was labeled with small colored stickers, blue for him, yellow for her. Their daughter, Emily, was 20 and away at college in Ann Arbor, and she called almost every night to ask her mother if she was okay. Rebecca always told her she was fine. Sweetheart, fine, fine. That was the lie Rebecca told most often that autumn. The small, decent lie of a woman who did not want her daughter to become a bookkeeper of her mother's grief. Rebecca had learned early, from watching her own mother go quiet in the years after her grandfather died, that grief could rearrange a child's life if you weren't careful about where you set it down. So every evening, when the phone rang, she sat up straighter and poured a glass of water. She did not intend to drink and said the word fine as though she had rehearsed it in the mirror. She had not. One evening in late September, Emily called from a study room in the library, keeping her voice low. She had a paper due on Monday about wetland ecosystems. Her lab partner had disappeared to a concert, and she was scared she was going to fail. She talked for 12 minutes without pausing. Rebecca listened and made small useful sounds and offered to read the draft, and did not once mention that she was, at that moment, sitting on the edge of a bed in a rented room, eating cold soup from a can with a plastic spoon. When Emily finally asked whether her mother was sure she was okay, Rebecca told her, again, that she was fine. Emily, who was 20 and no fool, answered in the exact tone Rebecca herself had used at 20 with her own mother, and went back to her wetlands. On the day she left the house for the last time, she packed lighter than she had expected. 22 years of a life, and it fit into 4 cardboard boxes in 1 suitcase. Some clothes, family photographs, Emily's kindergarten drawings, which Rebecca had never been able to throw away. An old quilt her mother had stitched by hand the winter Rebecca was born, worn thin now along one edge from a lifetime of being pulled up over shoulders. 2 coffee mugs from the cabinet by the sink. She did not realize, until much later, that she had packed Michael's blue mug along with her white one. Some habits survive longer than marriages. The blue mug had a small chip on the rim from a morning 3 or 4 Christmases ago, when Michael had knocked it against the counter reaching for the sugar. Rebecca could no longer remember which Christmas. She could remember. Exactly. The way he had laughed and told her it was a keeper. She had laughed too. That was the year she had believed. Still, that a small breakage could be lived around. Michael was outside when she carried the last box to the car. He stood near the garage door with his hands in his pockets, wearing the gray sweater she had bought him for his 43rd birthday. She had picked it out at a shop in Traverse City because the wool was soft and the color made his eyes look kinder than they were. He watched her load the trunk. He did not offer to help. He said her name once, and she closed the trunk, and then he told her to be realistic. She was 47. She couldn't just start over. The words followed her onto the driveway. They followed her down the street. They followed her past the elementary school where Emily had once won a poetry contest about a stray cat, and past the library where Rebecca had spent Saturday mornings in her 30s reading novels about women who did exactly the sort of thing she was now, apparently, incapable of doing. The words did not stop following her until she pulled into the driveway of the rented room she had leased for the month, and even then, when she cut the engine, she could hear them idling in the passenger seat like a person she had somehow agreed to give a ride to. You can't just start over. Frances was the widowed nurse who owned the house on Locust Avenue. 71, soft-soled shoes even at breakfast. The 2 second-floor rooms rented out because her husband had left her the house and the property taxes, but not, apparently, quite enough life insurance to cover both. Rebecca liked her the moment they met. Frances did not ask questions. She did not turn on the porch light after 9. She did not offer sympathy. She handed Rebecca a key and told her the heat was temperamental and to wear socks. The room was small, a twin bed with a green corduroy bedspread, a chair, a dresser, a lamp that flickered whenever the refrigerator downstairs cycled on. On the dresser sat a hot plate that Rebecca understood, without being told, was not strictly allowed. Her cardboard boxes stacked against the wall in a shape that was not quite a wall themselves. The window looked out on a bare maple and, beyond it, the neighbor's aluminum siding. The first 3 nights she slept in her clothes. Not from cold, though the room was cold. From something harder to name. When you have lived 22 years in a home you helped build with someone, and then you find yourself, at 47, opening a cabinet in a kitchen that belongs to a stranger to find a mug that belongs to a stranger, and pouring water from a tap that belongs to a stranger, and carrying that water in that mug up a staircase whose creaks you do not yet recognize, you begin to understand that certain kinds of loss are not events. They are addresses. On the 4th night, sometime around 2 in the morning, Rebecca could not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house Frances lived in. A pipe knocked, gently, twice somewhere in the wall behind her head. The refrigerator downstairs cycled on, and the lamp in the corner blinked and cycled off, and the lamp went steady. Outside, a car passed slowly with the wet hiss of tires on late October pavement, and then another car did not pass, and then the street was quiet. Every sound in that house belonged to somebody else. Even the silence between the sounds belonged to somebody else. Rebecca lay there and understood that she was not a guest and not a tenant and not a resident. She was a person waiting for her actual life to begin, and the actual life had not indicated when it might arrive. She sat up. She pulled her laptop off the floor and set it on her knees. She was not searching for anything in particular. She was, if anything, searching for something to make the hour pass without thinking. She scrolled through real estate listings the way another woman might scroll through recipes, small houses, studio apartments, a cabin on a lake in Wisconsin, a trailer in Traverse City. Then she saw it. Silver Pine Resort, Northern Michigan. Foreclosure sale. 11 cabins, a main lodge, a shuttered restaurant, a crumbling dock, nearly 40 acres of pine and cold, dark water. The photographs made the place look as though the forest had been slowly and patiently eating it for decades. The lodge roof had a mossy scar across one side. One cabin was missing a shutter. The dock leaned toward the lake at an angle that suggested it had given up some time ago. The price was low enough to frighten anyone sensible. Rebecca sat very still. She read the listing 3 times. She looked at every photograph. She calculated, quickly, what she had left after the divorce. She calculated what she would have if she spent almost all of it. She calculated what she would be, in that case, on the following morning. Then she did something the old Rebecca would never have done. She bought it. She clicked the button. She entered her card number. She read the terms. She signed digitally with a shaking finger and sat there afterward, at 2:40 in the morning, in a room that did not belong to her, staring at the confirmation screen. She had spent nearly every dollar she had left in the world on a place she had never seen, in a county she had never visited, in a life she had not yet worked out how to live. Then she closed the laptop and, for the first time in 3 months, she slept. The drive north took most of a day. She left Frances's house at 7 in the morning, with her boxes packed into the back of the SUV and the passenger seat occupied by a thermos of coffee, a paper map she had bought at a gas station because her phone kept losing signal, and the 2 mugs, wrapped in dish towels and set carefully upright inside a shoebox. She did not know why she had kept them both. She only knew that when she had gone to leave Michael's blue mug on the counter that morning, her hand had not obeyed her. It had wrapped the mug in a towel and set it in the shoebox beside the white one, and she had stood there in Frances's kitchen for a long moment looking at them, and then picked up the shoebox and walked out. She drove up I-75 as the suburbs thinned. Somewhere north of Grayling, the road narrowed. The maples gave way to pines. The pines closed over the highway in long green walls, and the towns became small enough that she could pass through them without slowing. There was a stretch, around 3 in the afternoon, when she realized she had not seen another car for perhaps 4 minutes. It was not alarming. It was only a fact. The kind of quiet fact you have to be a certain age to notice. Because in your 20s, silence feels like something has gone wrong, and in your 40s it begins to feel, sometimes, like something has quietly gone right. She stopped once at a diner for a bowl of tomato soup and a grilled cheese. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with a name tag that read Marge, poured her coffee without asking and observed that she wasn't from around here. Honey, Rebecca allowed that she wasn't yet. Marge nodded and moved on to the next table. By the time Rebecca turned off the county road onto the gravel drive that led to Silver Pine, it was late afternoon. The October light was the pale, sideways kind that makes everything look older than it is. A weather-beaten sign leaned against a pine at the entrance. Silver Pine Resort. Below it, in smaller letters that had been added later and had begun to peel, the single word closed. Rebecca turned off the engine. She sat there for a long time without moving. Everything she owned was packed behind her. Everything she had known was somewhere south of her. And everything ahead of her, framed through the windshield, looked broken. Faded cabins with tar paper patches on their roofs. A sagging lodge whose porch had begun to lean in the way old porches lean when a beam has quietly rotted through. A dock that seemed to be waist-deep in the wrong element. And behind all of it, a lake so still it looked like dark glass laid flat between the trees. She reached, without thinking, into the shoebox on the passenger seat. Her hand closed on the wrong mug. Michael's mug. The blue one. She held it up in the pale light. 22 years of mourning seemed to fit inside something she could hold with one hand, and it occurred to her that this was, in some ways, the smallest her marriage had ever been. She set the blue mug carefully back into the shoebox. She placed it at the bottom this time, beneath the white one, so that when she reached for a mug in the morning, her hand would meet her own. "One is enough now," she said, aloud, to nobody. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The wind off the lake found her at once. It smelled of pine sap and old water and, faintly, of wood smoke from some house a mile down the shore. Rebecca pulled her coat tight and stood there and let herself look. Silver Pine, in person, was colder and older and quieter than any photograph had prepared her for. But it was also, she realized, hers. Every rotted plank, every mossy shingle, every cabin she had not yet counted. She reached into her coat pocket for the manila envelope the county clerk had handed her that morning at the courthouse. 4 brass keys on a ring the size of a coffee saucer, none of them labeled. She walked up the sagging porch of the main lodge. She tried 3 of the 4 keys before the 4th turned. The bolt gave with a sound like a bone being reset. She pushed the door open. The lodge smelled of pine and cold ash and something older that she could not identify. Not decay, exactly. The smell of a room that had held its breath for a long time. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. There was a long dining room with a hearth at the far end, a registration desk built of dark wood, its brass bell green with age, sheets over the furniture that had, at some point in the last several decades, turned gray, an enormous elk head above the fireplace, dust on its antlers, one glass eye missing. She greeted the elk, aloud. She felt slightly foolish, then decided, on the spot, that talking to the elk was going to be permitted. She spent the first hour hauling boxes in from the SUV. She set them in the middle of the dining room, in a small square she could stand inside of, like a fort a child might build. She found the thermostat. She turned it up. Somewhere in the basement, an old oil furnace coughed twice, rattled like an ancient truck, and did not so much start as agree, grudgingly, to consider the possibility. She heard warm air move for perhaps 10 minutes. Then, just past 11, the furnace stopped coughing and simply died. Rebecca stood in the middle of the dining room in her coat, and she waited a full minute to see if it would reconsider. It did not. She could have called someone. She had a phone. There was a number for the county maintenance office in the paperwork the clerk had given her. There was, presumably, a repair company in a town 20 miles south that would answer at 11 at night for what she was sure would be a memorable fee. The old Rebecca, the woman who had lived 22 years in a house where the furnace was somebody else's job, would have made that call. Instead, she picked up a flashlight and walked outside. The maintenance shed was behind the lodge. Past a birch that had come down in some forgotten storm, she found the shed unlocked. Inside, along one wall, stood a neat stack of split pine that someone, 40 years ago or 50, had left behind. The wood was dry. It was probably not the best pine anyone had ever burned. It would do. She carried an armload back to the lodge and knelt at the hearth. There was an iron grate. There was a poker. There was a small tin of long matches on the mantel that had, miraculously, not turned to mush. She built a small teepee of splinters, the way her father had taught her one summer at a rented cabin she could barely remember. And she struck a match, and she watched the tin curl of pine catch and take. She sat back on her heels and watched her hands and understood, quietly, that she had not asked anyone's permission to do any of this. Not the walk to the shed, not the choice of wood, not the way she had built the teepee, small and hollow at the base, exactly as her father had shown her once and never again. For 22 years she had asked for permission before she rearranged a bookshelf. She had asked which weekend was better to invite her sister up. She had asked whether it was all right, please, if she painted the guest bathroom a color she liked. She had asked so long and so carefully that she had forgotten she was asking. And here, in the freezing dining room of a resort that no one else in the world knew she owned, her hands had simply built a fire, and nobody had asked whether they should. The fire lit her face. She realized, for the first time all evening, that she was not afraid. Her phone buzzed. Emily. A message that she had made it back from the library and loved her mom. Rebecca typed back that she loved her too and told her to get some sleep. Her thumb hovered. She thought about typing that she wished Emily were here. Then she thought about what it would do to Emily to receive that text from her mother, at 11 at night, from a resort in the middle of nowhere. She deleted the words. She locked the phone. She slid it back into her pocket. She dragged a wool blanket out of the nearest box and wrapped it around her shoulders and sat down on the floor near the fire. She listened to the wind move across the lake. She listened to the old building answer with creaks that she told herself firmly were only wood settling. She was not sure she believed it, but she found, sometime after midnight, that she was not entirely alone in her own company. That surprised her. She had been alone for months, in Francis's rented room. This was different. This was alone in a place she had chosen. She slept, eventually, on the floor. She woke to gray light and the taste of cold ash in her mouth. By 7, she had rebuilt the fire. By 8, she had made instant coffee in the white mug on a camp stove she had, thank God, remembered to pack. By 9, she had begun a list. It began sensibly. Roof, plumbing, windows. Then, somewhere around the middle of the second page, it lost its head. Wildlife in the pantry, Wildlife in the walls. Possible wildlife in the ceiling. The toilet in cabin 4 is missing. Entirely. The toilet in cabin 4 is a philosophical question. The front porch of cabin 7 appears to be growing a small tree. By the middle of the afternoon, the list covered 3 pages of a legal pad, front and back, in her neat teacher's daughter handwriting. She stood on the lodge porch and read the list aloud to the elk head, which had followed her out in spirit if not in fact. And by the time she reached the note about the tree on the porch, she was laughing. She stopped, briefly, and listened to herself. It was the first time she had laughed since June. Wonderful investment, Rebecca, she told the empty air, and then went back inside for the broom. She spent the next 2 days working. She swept and dragged and hauled and pried. She hung a bird feeder on a nail she found in a drawer, because she had read somewhere that if you feed the birds, a property begins to feel yours a little faster. She discovered that half a can of paint had frozen and thawed and frozen again in the maintenance shed and was now a dense, unusable disc. She discovered, more happily, that the dining room floor, under the sheet of old newspapers laid down decades ago against a leak, was made of quarter-sawn oak that was, if you looked at it in the right light, still beautiful. She wrote that in the margin of her list. Beautiful floor. Underline. 2 exclamation points. She discovered other things too. A stack of Life magazines in a linen closet. The top one dated August 1979, the paper soft as fabric. A child's mitten wedged between the boards of the porch, faded to no color at all. A mason jar of buttons on a windowsill in the kitchen, as if a woman had once sat down there to sew and set the jar aside and simply never come back for it. Rebecca kept the buttons. She could not have said why. By the 3rd morning she had a system. Cabins first, from the road end inward. Photograph everything before touching it. Note the number of the cabin on every photograph. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt any structural repair without a professional. Do not, under any circumstances, feel sorry for herself before noon. The last rule was the one she broke. By the 4th afternoon, a soft rain had started, and she had run out of things to do that did not involve getting wet. She retreated to what had once been the manager's office at the back of the lodge. It was a small room with a metal desk, a rotary telephone, and 4 filing cabinets that were, when she opened them, disappointingly empty. Whoever had closed Silver Pine had cleaned the office thoroughly. Rebecca sighed and sat in the manager's chair, which had a spring loose in the seat, and considered the empty cabinets. Then she thought to try the desk drawers. The top drawer held pens that no longer wrote, a Rolodex with 3 cards left in it, and a small key that fit nothing she had yet found. The second drawer held a stack of expired matchbooks with the Silver Pine logo on them, a promotional pamphlet from 1979 and a rubber-banded stack of postcards. Rebecca lifted the stack out. They were the old sort, thick as playing cards, with the words Silver Pine Resort in a cursive that had gone out of style before Rebecca had been born. She thumbed through them. 2 showed the lodge in summer, its porch strung with paper lanterns. 1 showed a couple standing on the dock, laughing at something outside the frame. 1 showed children fishing off a rowboat, and 1, larger than the others, was a panoramic view of the entire property, taken from the water, so that the whole shore of Silver Pine was laid out in 1 long strip like a diorama. She turned that one over. Summer at Silver Pine, 1988. She turned it back. She looked at it for a long time in the gray light coming through the office window. Something about the picture was not quite right. She could not immediately say what. It was a feeling in her chest, the small, quiet feeling she used to get in the early years of her marriage, when Michael would tell her he had been at the office and she would think, without knowing why, that he had not been at the office. She counted. 1 cabin at the far end where the shoreline curved south. 2, 3, 4 along the flat run of pine. 5, 6, tucked back among the birches. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, near the boathouse. Then, past the boathouse, tucked so far back among the pines that she almost missed it. A 12th. Rebecca stared at the postcard. Then she got up and went to the file box on the desk, where she had put the county paperwork the clerk had given her. She flipped through it until she found the property description. Guest cabins, 11. She checked the insurance rider, 11. She unfolded the surveyor's map, which had been filed with the county in the late 70s. There, drawn in the small, neat hand of a surveyor named Halloran, she counted the cabins around the shore, 1 through 11. She looked back at the postcard, 12. She counted the paper cabins again, slowly this time. She used the tip of a pen so she would not lose her place. She stopped at each roof and each porch and each small pale shape of a chimney standing up against the dark line of pines behind. She reached the same number, 12. She turned the postcard over again to make sure she was reading it correctly. Summer at Silver Pine, 1988. She turned it back. She counted a third time. 12. An entire building, Rebecca thought, does not simply disappear from a county record. Not on it. Anyway, she stood up. The rain had softened into a fine, cold mist by the time she pulled on her coat and stepped out onto the porch. She stood for a moment looking north, where the shoreline bent past the boathouse and disappeared into pine. She could not, from where she stood, see any cabin beyond the 11th. There was nothing but trees. She went anyway. The trail, if there had ever been one, had almost entirely surrendered to weeds and fallen branches. She had to duck under one low limb, step over a rotten fence post, and squeeze between two young birches that had grown up in the middle of what had probably once been a footpath. Her boots grew heavy with wet leaves. Twice she thought about turning back. Twice she kept going, because the postcard was folded in her coat pocket, and she could feel it against her ribs like a small, insistent hand. She walked for perhaps 15 minutes. Then the trees opened. There it was. A cabin, smaller than the others. A single slanted roof. Windows boarded from the outside with plywood that had gone gray with weather. A stone step at the front door, half sunk into the soil. Moss on the shingles. A porch with 2 rotted planks that had fallen in. A rusted length of chain wrapped 3 times around the door handle and padlocked to an eye bolt sunk into the frame. And above the door, a tarnished brass plate. 12. Rebecca stood very still. The old Rebecca. The woman who had lived in a house where somebody else opened the strange doors. Would have gone back to the lodge. She would have called the county. She would have waited until Monday morning. She would have done the correct and reasonable thing. Instead, she walked back to the maintenance shed. 20 minutes later, she returned, carrying a pry bar and a claw hammer. Her back protested. Her hands were shaking slightly, from the cold or from something else. She wedged the pry bar into the padlock. She braced her foot against the doorframe. She pulled. The eye bolt gave first. It came out of the wood with a small, mean sound, and the chain fell in a heap on the porch, and Rebecca stood there breathing hard, looking at the door. She tried the handle. The door was not locked. The chain, she realized, had been the only thing holding it closed. It opened with a long wooden groan. Cold air met her. Not the sharp cold of outdoors, but a stale indoor cold, the kind that lives in a place that has been closed up for a very long time. Rebecca hesitated on the threshold. Then she stepped inside. The single room was small, a narrow iron bed against the far wall, still made, its blanket folded once at the foot, a small square table with 2 mismatched chairs, a stone fireplace, ashes still in the grate, a wardrobe against the west wall, a shelf holding 3 tin cups and a chip saucer, a rag rug on the floor, the kind old women used to braid from scraps in the evenings. Rebecca looked around slowly. A woman's wool coat hung on the hook beside the door, navy blue, 2 buttons missing, a gray silk scarf tucked into the pocket. On the small table sat a coffee cup, upright on a saucer, with a faded red flower painted along the rim. The cup was empty. There was a ring of old coffee dried in the bottom of it, and Rebecca could not tell whether it was a week old or 50 years old. Though logic said the second, she took a step further in. She reached out and touched the wool coat, lightly, at the hem. Damp, cold, but not rotten. She lifted the scarf out of the pocket. It smelled, faintly, of something floral that had long since faded past a name. Rose, perhaps, or lily of the valley. She put it back exactly where she had found it, folded the way it had been folded. The clock on the wall above the fireplace had stopped. Its hands stood at 2:17. She stared at that for a moment. Not because a stop clock was strange in an abandoned building, but because it wasn't. Because it was the sort of thing you noticed only when the rest of the room had started to insist, quietly, that it had not been abandoned so much as left in a hurry. The coat was still hanging. The cup was still on the table. The bed was made. Rebecca had grown up in a house where her mother made the bed every morning. She knew the difference between a bed left made and a bed that had simply not been slept in. This bed had been made, turned down at the corner, blanket folded once at the foot. Someone had woken here, and stood, and folded the blanket, and expected to come back to it that night. Rebecca could feel the expectation in the room the way you can feel a stove that was warm an hour ago. Nobody, Rebecca thought, walks away from a place forever and leaves a coat on the hook. She moved further in. Her boots scraped on the floorboards, and she looked down, and she saw them. Marks. Long, pale scratches ran across the floorboards from the base of the wardrobe toward the center of the room. Someone had dragged the wardrobe, or something like the wardrobe, back and forth across the boards more than once. Rebecca crouched. She ran her fingers along one of the scratches. The wood beneath was clean. The scratches were old but not shallow. Something heavy had moved along that line more than a few times. She stood up. She looked at the wardrobe. The wardrobe was heavy, dark, and roughly the size of a coffin stood on end. It had a mirror on the front door, wavy with age. Rebecca gripped the near side of it with both hands and pulled. Nothing. She tried again, bracing her hip against it, using her legs the way a woman moves furniture when there is no man in the house to do it for her, which is the way she had moved most of the furniture she had ever owned. Come to think of it, the wardrobe rocked. It shifted, perhaps an inch, along one of the old scratches. She pulled again. Another inch. Michael's voice, unbidden, spoke in her head. Be realistic. Rebecca, you're 47. You can't just start over. She stopped, her hands still on the wood, her breath coming hard. Maybe I can't, she told the cold room. But I can go downstairs. She pulled again. The wardrobe moved another inch, then another. She worked it, an inch at a time, in the same track its own weight had worn into the floor. Her back was going to have opinions about this in the morning. She did not care. She kept going until the wardrobe had cleared its former footprint by the width of both her hands. And then, breathing hard, she stopped and looked at the floor. A square outline had been cut into the boards, perhaps 3 feet by 3. A brass ring lay flat against the wood on one edge, as if it had been dropped and forgotten there. A trap door. Rebecca stood over it for a long moment. She thought, without quite meaning to, about every horror movie she had ever half-watched. She thought about how a sensible woman would call the county sheriff and wait until morning. She thought about how a sensible woman had spent 22 years being sensible and had ended up, at 47, in a rented room, listening to a stranger's refrigerator cycle on and off, with a laptop on her knees at 2 in the morning. She knelt. She hooked her finger through the ring. She pulled. The trap door lifted with almost no resistance at all. A narrow flight of wooden steps descended into darkness. Cold air rose from below. It smelled of paper and old dust and something faintly mineral that Rebecca recognized after a moment as the smell of a root cellar. She reached into her coat pocket for the flashlight she had, thankfully, learned to carry 2 days ago. She sat down on the edge of the opening. She lowered one boot to the first step. It held. She counted the steps as she went down. 9. The ceiling was low enough that she had to duck her head as she reached the bottom. She stood on a hard-packed dirt floor. She swept the flashlight beam around. She was in a small windowless room, perhaps 10 feet by 12. Wooden shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, and the shelves were not empty. Boxes, dozens of them. Cardboard file boxes stacked 2 deep on some shelves, single on others. Old photograph albums with cracked leather spines. Ledger books bound in black cloth. Envelopes tied together in bundles with faded green string. A wooden tray of what looked, in the flashlight beam, like film reels in their round metal cans. Manila folders labeled in a small, careful hand with names Rebecca did not recognize. Peterson, Millwright, Sokolov, Hannaford. Rebecca stood very still in the middle of the room. Nobody, she thought again, walks away from a place forever and leaves a coat on the hook. And nobody carries this many boxes down a ladder in the middle of a cabin's floor and then simply forgets about them. She moved slowly along the near wall, playing the flashlight over the shelves. She did not touch anything at first. She only looked. Old land plats, loan agreements, a file-marked township, 1963, something that appeared to be a stack of typed letters bound in twine, a photograph album labeled Silver Pine Summers. On the third shelf, on the right side, she stopped. A gray document box sat by itself, slightly apart from the others, as if someone had set it down and never come back for it. Unlike the labeled folders around it, the box had only a single word written across the front, in faded black ink, in a hand that looked feminine. Collins. Rebecca stood still. There were thousands of Collinses in America. It was a common name. It could mean anything. It could mean nothing at all. It could be the name of some other family who had once, briefly, stayed at the resort, and someone had gathered their belongings and stored them and never gotten around to shipping them home. That was possible. That was, she told herself, the most likely explanation. She reached toward the box. Then she stopped, her hand hovering an inch from the lid. She lowered her hand. She stepped back. She turned the flashlight over the rest of the shelf. Slowly, there were 7 boxes on that shelf. 6 of them had labels. Township, 1963. Millwright deed, 1971. Hale ledger. Property assessments, 1979 to 1985. Peterson, land agreement. And, on the far right, tucked slightly back from the edge, as if it had been slid there on purpose to make it less visible, the gray box. Collins, just Collins. No date, no qualifier, not Collins family, not Collins property, not Collins account, as though the person who had written that word had known exactly which Collins was meant and had assumed anyone else who ever found the box would know too. Rebecca's mouth had gone dry. She thought, quite suddenly and against her will, of her father, Thomas Collins, who had died 6 years ago in a hospital in Grand Rapids of a slow bad heart, and who had never in her 47 years of life mentioned the words Silver Pine to her. Not once, not at dinner, not at the lake cabin they had rented for 2 weeks every August when she was a child, not on the drives up north when they passed the exit for the county Silver Pine was in, and her father, who could talk to a fence post about a Tigers game, had gone quiet. She had not thought about that quietness in decades. She thought about it now. She reached, again, for the box. This time she did not stop. She lifted the lid. Inside, on top of everything else, lay a single photograph. She picked it up carefully by its edges and held it under the flashlight beam. A young man stood on a wooden dock in summer light, rolled up shirt sleeves, dark hair, thick and slightly windblown, one hand shading his eyes against the sun. Behind him, the lake was a bright, flat sheet. He had that half-smile she had seen in every childhood photograph of him. The one he did instead of a full smile because he had always been a little shy of cameras. She turned the photograph over. 2 lines had been written on the back in the same feminine hand that had written the word on the box. Tom, Silver Pine, summer 1988. Rebecca stared at the photograph. Her father had been in his late 20s in 1988. Her father had never told her he had been to Silver Pine. Her father had, apparently, been to Silver Pine so often, or so long, or so meaningfully, that someone had stored a photograph of him in a box in a hidden room beneath a cabin that did not officially exist. The flashlight trembled slightly in her hand. She lowered the photograph. She looked at the gray box. She looked at the shelves around her. She looked at the ladder rising into the low ceiling above her head. She had come north to disappear. She had come north because a man had told her that at 47 she was too old to start over. And she had needed a place to prove him wrong, or a place to hide, or a place simply to be alone with what was left of her. She had chosen this resort out of a foreclosure listing at 2 in the morning in a rented room, on a laptop that had been running out of battery. She had chosen it. She had believed, by accident. Standing there in the small windowless room beneath cabin 12, with her father's face in her hand and a box marked with her family name at her feet. Rebecca Collins understood, quite clearly and quite calmly, that she might not have chosen anything at all. Something else, or someone else, might have chosen for her. And for the first time since Michael had lowered his voice across the coffee at the kitchen table 3 months ago, Rebecca Collins was no longer afraid of being alone. She was afraid of not being alone at all. She carried the box upstairs. She did not remember, later, exactly how. She remembered lifting the lid back down onto the box and cradling it against her chest and climbing the 9 wooden steps one at a time and pushing the trapdoor up with her shoulder because both her arms were full. She remembered the cold air of the cabin meeting her at the top. She remembered setting the box down on the small square table beside the coffee cup with the red flower rim. And she remembered how much the table protested the weight, as though it had been holding nothing at all for a very long time and had forgotten how to hold something. She sat down in one of the mismatched chairs. She switched on the small camping lantern she had brought back with the pry bar. The lantern threw a warm circle onto the tabletop. She opened the box. She took the photographs out one at a time and laid them across the table in the order she found them. Her father, young, on the dock. Her father sitting on the porch steps of the cabin she was sitting in now, in summer, with 2 potted geraniums flanking the door and no chain anywhere in evidence. Her father in a rowboat. Her father with a beer in his hand and his sleeves rolled up, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. He looked young and unwounded and easy in his own skin, in a way Rebecca had almost never seen at home. She had grown up with the version of Thomas Collins who did not, as a rule, laugh with his mouth open. Beneath those lay one that stopped her, her father again, on the same wooden dock. But he was not alone this time. A woman stood beside him with her arm resting lightly across the top of his shoulders, dark hair pulled back, a confident face, late summer sun on both of them. The woman was perhaps in her early 30s. She had her chin slightly lifted, the way people do when they have made peace with being taller than most of the men they know. Her father was smiling in the crooked half-smile way, but he was smiling at her, not at the camera. It was the smile of a younger brother. Rebecca had never had an aunt, not on her father's side. Her father had told her, many times over the years, that he had grown up an only child in a small house in Muskegon and that his parents were dead and that there was no one else. He had said it in a tone that closed the subject. Rebecca, who had asked twice as a child and never as an adult, had taken it as a fact of the landscape, like the color of the front door. She turned the photograph over. 2 lines had been written on the back in the same feminine hand. Thomas and Margaret Collins. August 1988. Rebecca sat very still. She read the 2 words twice, then a third time, in case something on the back of the photograph rearranged itself while she was not looking. It did not. Margaret Collins. An aunt. An aunt her father had denied her existence for 40 years. She set the photograph down carefully on the table, and she reached back into the box. Because of whatever else this box was, it was not going to explain itself. Beneath the photographs lay a folder tied shut with faded green string. Rebecca untied it. The knot was old. It gave grudgingly. Then all at once, inside was a stack of documents whose top page was a property agreement dated April of 1987. She scanned it. Names, addresses, county recording numbers, the small, dry vocabulary of an American land transfer. Near the bottom of the page, she found what she had already begun to expect. Margaret Collins, partial owner. Silver Pine Resort. There were signatures on both sides. Margaret's, someone named Halverson. A seller. A stamp from the county clerk in a color of ink Rebecca had not seen since her childhood. Margaret Collins had owned a share of the resort Rebecca had, 40 years later, bought out of foreclosure. Rebecca pressed the heels of both hands against her eyes. She sat like that for a long minute. When she took her hands away, the photographs were still on the table and the property agreement was still in her lap, and none of it had corrected itself into a version of the world she recognized. She kept going. Beneath the folder lay a small leather notebook, the kind an accountant might have carried. The leather was dark green, worn pale along the spine, and the pages inside were narrow-ruled and covered, most of them, in that same careful feminine hand, Margaret's hand, dates, property numbers, names, Some of the entries were tidy, almost bookish. Others, near the back of the notebook, were hurried, the letters leaning slightly forward, as if written in a hurry or in fear. Rebecca read. The first entries began in the spring of 1988. Margaret had begun keeping notes on land transfers around the lake. Older residents were selling shoreline parcels for prices that made no sense. A widow named Alma Peterson had signed over 17 acres to a firm Margaret referred to only as HDC for the sum of $14,000. Margaret had scribbled beside the entry, in the margin. She didn't understand what they gave her. The Miller family, on the north end of the lake, had transferred 23 acres after allegedly defaulting on a loan Margaret could find no evidence they had ever received. Margaret had circled the word allegedly twice. Rebecca kept reading. Toward the back of the notebook, the entries grew shorter and more urgent. She saw the name Peterson again, and Millwright, and Hannaford, and other names she had not yet placed. And then, on a right-hand page near the end, she saw the name that made her stop breathing. Hale, not Richard, not a first name at all, just the family name, standing alone, as though the writer had known no other name was necessary. 2 pages later, a shorter entry, in the hurried version of Margaret's handwriting, Hale knows I'm making copies. The page after that was blank. The page after that. The page after that. The entries did not resume. Rebecca flipped to the very back of the notebook, looking for anything else. She found only one more sentence, written diagonally across the inside back cover, in a hand that had almost given up on being tidy. When the lake gives back the old dock, the truth will come with it. That was all. Rebecca closed the notebook. She sat there with her hand flat against its cover. Outside, the wind had begun to lift a little in the pines, and somewhere far down the lake a loon called once and did not call again. 9 hours ago, she had gotten out of bed in the manager's cottage to fry an egg, thinking about roof shingles. Now she was sitting in a hidden cabin at a table that did not belong to her, holding a notebook that belonged to an aunt her father had spent his whole life pretending did not exist, reading a sentence that made her feel, unmistakably, as though someone had been waiting a long time for her to arrive. She did not sleep well that night. In the morning, she drove into town. The town of Birch Hollow had a population of 1,100 people, most of whom appeared to be over 60, and a downtown that consisted of one intersection, a hardware store, a diner, a Presbyterian church, and a small square brick building that housed both the public library and the county historical archive on opposite sides of a shared reading room. Rebecca parked in front of the diner and walked over. A bell tinkled above the archive door when she pushed it open. Behind a wooden counter at the far end of the room sat a woman with silver hair worn in a French braid and half-moon reading glasses on a beaded chain. She looked up over her glasses when Rebecca came in and, without preamble, observed that Rebecca was the woman who had bought the resort. News travels in a small county, sometimes with embroidery. She set aside the book she had been cataloging and introduced herself as Dorothy Walsh and asked what she could help her find. Rebecca walked the length of the room to the counter. She unzipped the interior pocket of her coat and drew out the photograph she had chosen to bring. Thomas and Margaret Collins, August 1988. She laid it on the counter, face up, and turned it so Dorothy could see the front. She was hoping, she said, that Dorothy could tell her anything she knew about the woman in this picture. Dorothy looked down. Rebecca watched her face. It was not a face that hid things well. Something passed across it in a single beat, the way a shadow moves across a lawn when a small cloud crosses the sun. And then Dorothy folded her reading glasses very carefully and set them on the counter beside the photograph. Where had Rebecca gotten this? She wanted to know. Rebecca answered that she had found it at Silver Pine. Dorothy asked whether that had been in the manager's office. Not exactly, Rebecca replied. Dorothy looked up at her then, and for a second Rebecca understood that Dorothy Walsh had been waiting, quietly and for a very long time, for someone to walk through this door with this photograph. That was Margaret Collins. Dorothy told her. Rebecca did not need to say she'd guessed as much. Everybody knew Margaret, Dorothy added. Rebecca kept her voice steady when she offered that Margaret had been her father's sister. Dorothy nodded once, slowly, as though this confirmed something she had suspected but not been sure of. Thomas Collins, she repeated, half to herself. She had only met him once or twice. and he had not been, if Rebecca did not mind her saying, the outdoors half of that pair. He never told me she existed, Rebecca said. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Some things got carried into houses and did not come out again. She offered eventually. They just sat there. Rebecca asked what had happened to her. Dorothy glanced toward the reading room door as if to be sure no one else had come in, then reached under the counter and brought out a battered kettle and a chipped enamel mug. She invited Rebecca to sit down. Some of this, she said, needed a chair under it. Rebecca sat. Dorothy had lived in this county for 73 years, and she remembered Margaret Collins in particular because Margaret had been, for a summer or two in the late 80s, the closest thing the town ever had to a full-time troublemaker. Not the bad kind, the kind of woman who asked the sort of questions that made older people close their front doors more gently than usual when they saw her walking up the drive. Margaret had been buying into the resort with a man named Halverson, Dorothy explained, pouring hot water into a second mug and dropping a bag of orange pico into it and pushing it across the counter. Halverson had been the previous owner. He'd wanted out. Margaret and a couple of others had taken shares in the property. She was going to run the summer program. She loved that lake. She used to swim in it in May, before anyone with sense would put a toe in. Rebecca asked what had gone wrong. Around that time, Dorothy said, land had been moving fast up here, not just at Silver Pine, all along the North Shore. Older folks, mostly widows, mostly people who had inherited their parcels a long time ago and didn't have anyone at home to explain the paperwork to them. They were signing things and the shoreline was quietly changing owners. Margaret had started noticing. Notes, Rebecca offered. She had gone door to door, Dorothy confirmed. She'd been a nurse by training, so she'd known how to talk to old people. She'd written things down. She had gotten into the habit of coming in to make copies. Deeds, tax cards, loan agreements. Anything anybody would let her have. In that last summer, she'd spent more time in this reading room than she had at the resort. Rebecca thought of the sentence on the back cover of the notebook. She said nothing. 3 days before Margaret supposedly left, Dorothy went on. She had come in and asked Dorothy how a person might make copies of certain records without anyone at the county clerk's office knowing she had asked for them. Rebecca wanted to know whether she had said why. Dorothy told her Margaret hadn't had to. And then a note went around that she'd moved to Canada to go be with a man in Sudbury. Nobody had ever heard about the man in Sudbury. Silver Pine closed the following summer. Halverson went into foreclosure. The other partners walked away, and Margaret Collins was not seen in this county again. You didn't believe it, Rebecca offered. Dorothy picked up her reading glasses and put them back on and folded her hands on the counter. She had been a librarian for a very long time. When somebody who had spent 3 years asking questions no one wanted asked suddenly moved to another country without saying goodbye to a single soul. She had opinions about it, but opinions and evidence were not. She reminded them both the same thing. Rebecca sipped her tea. It was too hot. She set it down. Had Margaret ever mentioned a family named Hale? Rebecca wanted to know. Dorothy went still. After a moment, she allowed that Margaret had. Would they be around here still? One of them would. Who? Dorothy hesitated. She used Rebecca's first name for the first time, and something in her tone made Rebecca understand that Dorothy had done the arithmetic of the last 5 minutes and had arrived at a place she did not entirely want to be. Whatever she had found up there at that resort, Dorothy told her, she should be careful who she showed it to, and please, please, she should not make copies of anything in this reading room. Rebecca held her eyes. All right, she agreed. Dorothy nodded once, satisfied. Then she reached under the counter again and slid a small piece of paper across to Rebecca. Handwritten, in her neat backhand. A phone number. That was her home line. She explained, not the archive. If Rebecca needed her. Rebecca took the paper. She folded it once, carefully, and slid it into the same inside pocket her photograph had come out of. She thanked her and stood. Rebecca. Dorothy called her name once more. Her aunt, she said, had been one of the finest women she had ever known. Whatever Rebecca was doing up there, she hoped she did it well. Rebecca drove back to Silver Pine slowly. She took the long way, along the county road that curved past the north end of the lake, because she needed the time. She had come north because a man had told her she could not start over. She had bought a resort to prove him wrong. She had, along the way, apparently inherited someone else's unfinished work, and she was not entirely sure yet whether she was equal to it. She was not entirely sure either that she got to choose. She turned down the gravel drive toward the lodge and slowed to a stop. A black luxury SUV was parked beside the porch. Rebecca sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel. There was no one visible in the driver's seat. The SUV was clean, dark, expensive-looking. The sort of vehicle that arrived somewhere on purpose. She pulled up beside it and turned off her engine and got out. A man stood down by the lake. I was maybe 70, silver hair, cut short, brushed neatly back, a camel-colored wool coat that stopped at his knees, leather gloves, good boots. He was looking out over the water with his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man who had inspected many things in his life and had gotten used to being able to. He turned when he heard her boots on the gravel. He greeted her pleasantly, by name, and asked her to forgive the trespass. Her gate had been open. "Who are you?" She wanted to know. "Richard Hale," he told her, walking up from the water. He did not offer his hand this time, which was, she thought, either good manners or good instincts. He had heard someone had finally bought Silver Pine. That kind of news traveled quickly around here, so she kept being told. He smiled. He had the smile of a man who was used to being smiled back at, and who did not appear terribly troubled when he was not. His family had had interests up and down this lake for generations, he explained. Silver Pine had been on his radar for a long time. He had stopped by, frankly, out of curiosity. Curiosity, she repeated, and to save her some trouble. He glanced at the lodge, then back at her. She was, if she did not mind him saying, in over her head. Property like this ate money. The roof alone, the dock, the taxes. She would bleed for 2 years before it broke even, and he would guess, from the vehicle she was driving, that 2 years was longer than she could afford to bleed. She did not recall asking his opinion. Mr. Hale. He inclined his head, acknowledging the point. He would like to buy the property from her. He told her. She had just bought it. He knew. How much? $650,000. Rebecca did not move. She had paid a fraction of that number, not even a large fraction. If she said yes to this man, right now, standing on the gravel in front of her own lodge, she could pay for Emily's college outright, put a down payment on a house in a warm state, and never open another envelope from a plumber for the rest of her life. Why? She asked. Richard Hale considered her. Some properties, he told her, were worth more to certain people than they were to others. His family had a long relationship with this shoreline. That relationship had some historical weight to it. Sentiment, if she wanted to be gentle about it. Sentiment, she repeated. That was a real thing. Mrs. Collins. She said nothing. She let the silence sit between them. She had not learned that trick from Michael, who had always filled every silence he encountered. She had learned it from her mother, who had been very good at knowing when not to. Richard Hale, after a moment, produced a business card from an interior pocket of his coat and held it out to her between 2 fingers. She took it. Heavy cardstock, embossed. Hale Development Company, in raised black letters. A phone number. An address in Grand Rapids. He suggested she think about it, that his offer would stand. His eyes moved past her. They tracked, very briefly, toward the north end of the property, past the 11th cabin, past the boathouse, in a direction almost no one would have any reason to look. She hadn't opened the old north cabin, had she? He wanted to know. It was said pleasantly. It was said the way another man might have wondered whether she had tried the coffee at the diner. Rebecca had been raised by a father who could go silent, and she had been married for 22 years to a man who had, apparently, been leaving her for 8 of them, and she had learned along the way to keep her face still under provocation. She kept it still now. "What cabin?" she asked. For a fraction of a second, Richard Hale's smile disappeared. It came back so smoothly that a person who had not been watching for it would not have seen it go. Rebecca had been watching for it. His mistake, he offered lightly. He had been told there were only 11. There were 11. She confirmed. Of course. He turned to walk toward his SUV. She let him get almost to the driver's door before she spoke his name. He looked back. Had he known Margaret Collins? She asked. The gravel between them was very quiet. Richard Hale stood in front of his open car door for a long moment without moving. He did not answer her. He did not need to. His silence was, in itself, the answer. Then he inclined his head to her again, in the way that men of a certain generation and station will do when they wish to end a conversation without conceding they have lost anything in it. Enjoy Silver Pine, Mrs. Collins, he told her. Hein got into his SUV. He started it. He drove away. Rebecca stood on the gravel with his business card still between her fingers and watched the taillights disappear between the pines. She did not move until she could no longer hear the engine. Then she went inside and locked the door, which was something she had not done since the day she had arrived. She went back to cabin 12 the next morning. This time she brought a notebook of her own, a pen, a thermos of coffee, and Frances's landlady voice in her head telling her to wear socks. She sat at the table in the cold morning light with Margaret's notebook open in front of her, and she read it through again from the first page to the last. She did not know what she was looking for. She only knew that she had missed something the first time, and she was in no hurry, and Margaret was in no position to explain her own filing system. She stopped at the sentence on the inside back cover. When the lake gives back the old dock, the truth will come with it. The old dock, not the dock, the old dock, meaning that there had been, at some point, a newer one, meaning that there had been two. Rebecca set the notebook down. She drove into town again. Dorothy was not surprised to see her. Dorothy did not, in fact, appear surprised by very much. Rebecca asked her, without preamble, whether Silver Pine had ever had more than one dock. Dorothy looked at her over the tops of her reading glasses and told her to come with her. She led Rebecca to a metal map cabinet at the back of the reading room and slid open the third drawer from the bottom. She pulled out a large linen-backed county map, folded into eighths, dated in the corner in a corner-stamped ink 1987. She spread it out on a reading table. She smoothed it flat with the sides of her hands, the way a woman might smooth a tablecloth she had inherited from her mother. That was Silver Pine, she told Rebecca, tapping a spot along the western shore of the lake. That was the main dock, right by the lodge, and that she moved her finger north along the shoreline, past a cluster of small squares that were the cabins. Past the boathouse was the second dock. Rebecca looked. A short dark line, drawn perpendicular to the shore, extended from the northern end of the property out into the lake, right about where the trail behind the cabins ended. Nobody talked about it, Dorothy said, because it had gone in a storm. Fall of '88. That was what everyone had been told anyway. Halverson hadn't rebuilt. He'd said the North Shore was too rocky and there was no point. Then Silver Pine had closed the summer after, and nobody had had reason to think about the north end of the shoreline again. Fall of 1988, Rebecca repeated. Yes. Rebecca thought about the year on the back of the photograph. She thought about the entry in the notebook. She thought about the phrase, when the lake gives back the old dock. When was the lake at its lowest? She wanted to know. Late fall, Dorothy told her. Right about now. Actually, before the ice came in. Rebecca thanked her. She rolled the map up carefully and gave it back. And Dorothy did not. This time offer her tea. Rebecca thought Dorothy could see, from her face, that they had passed the point where tea was going to help. She drove north. She parked at the lodge, changed into her work boots, and walked up the shoreline past the cabins and past the boathouse and out along the pebbled north beach. The lake air was raw. The pines behind her were making the small dry sound of pines in October, which is a sound like paper being carefully torn a page at a time. She walked for perhaps half a mile. Then she saw them. 3 dark wooden posts, barnacled with green weed, rising out of the shallow water about 10 feet from the beach. Rebecca crouched at the water's edge and looked. The posts were the remains of a dock. Most of what had once stood on them had rotted away or been pulled down by ice, but the 3 closest to shore still stood. The lake had receded far enough this autumn that she could see, beneath the shallow water between the posts, the pale ghost of a foundation. She sat back on her heels. She took off her boots. She rolled her jeans up above the knee. She stepped into the water. The cold hit her like needles. Terrible idea, she muttered to herself. She kept walking. She followed the line of posts out until the water reached mid-thigh. Under the water, running between the two farther posts, was a low platform of joined timbers, half buried in the sand, and bolted to the underside of one of the joists. Wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and was now a black shredded skin, was a rectangular shape roughly the size of a shoebox. Rebecca reached down. The oilcloth came away in her hand in a wet strip. Underneath was steel, a steel box, bolted through both flanges into the wood of the joist with 4 heavy carriage bolts. She stared at it. Then she waded back to shore, put her boots on over cold, wet feet, and half ran back up the shoreline toward the maintenance shed, where she had seen, days earlier, an old wrench hanging on a nail. It took 20 minutes and most of the feeling in her hands. She waded back out with the wrench in her teeth so both her hands would be free. She braced against the joist and put the wrench on the first bolt and pulled. The bolt was thicker than her thumb and older than she was, and for a long moment she was sure she was going to have to come back with a hacksaw and a stronger person than herself. Then, with a small squeal, the bolt began to turn. She took the box back to cabin 12. She set it on the little table beside Margaret's notebook, and she went and built a fire in the small stone hearth, because if she did not warm her hands, she was going to lose the feeling in her fingers permanently, and Grace Mercer, whoever Grace Mercer was going to turn out to be, would not thank her for it. She sat by the fire until her fingers came back. Then she went to the table and opened the steel box. She had, on the walk back, allowed herself the small childish fantasy that it might contain money, or jewelry, or gold coins, or any of the things that make a person's second half of life easier than the first. It contained paper, nothing but paper, dozens of documents, sealed inside heavy plastic sleeves, the plastic clouded with age but the paper inside crisp as new, original property deeds, loan agreements, bank transfer records, photographs of what appeared to be signed contracts, photocopies of tax cards, a carbon paper receipt for the sale of 17 shoreline acres from an Alma Peterson to a company called HDC Holdings for the sum of $14,000. Rebecca laid them out on the table one by one, in the order Margaret had, apparently, filed them. The pattern took her perhaps 40 minutes to see. Old people, mostly widows, mostly people who owned lakefront acreage by inheritance and had lived on it long enough to think of it as an inevitable feature of the landscape, had signed over parcels of that land at prices that would not have bought a used car in the year the transfers had happened. Some of the transfers cited debts. Rebecca could find, in the box, no supporting paperwork for the debts. Some cited buyout of prior arrangement. Rebecca could find no prior arrangement. The buyers were a small tangle of entities: HDC Holdings, Halverson Land Trust, North Shore Investments, LLC, Lakefront Property Group. On paper, they were separate companies. Their addresses were separate. Their signing officers were separate. Their eventual owner, Rebecca discovered on the second-to-last page, was the same: Hale Development Company. Rebecca sat back in her chair. She looked, for a long minute, at the fire in the little stone hearth. She listened to a pine knot pop. She had come to this box, she realized, expecting to find something personal: a murder, a missing body, a love letter that would have made her father a villain or a saint. Instead, she had found something much more ordinary, something so ordinary it had, in her lifetime, happened to a friend of hers who had lost a house to a bank in 2009, and to another friend whose mother had signed away a family farm because a young man in a nice suit had explained the paperwork to her while her son was at work. Homes, retirement savings, land that families had planned to leave to their children, places where lives had happened. Rebecca thought, without meaning to, of the young woman standing in her old yard pointing out where a swing set could go, and of how it had felt to sit on the far side of the kitchen window and watch a stranger plan her lawn. For the first time since she had unlocked the door of the lodge, Margaret's obsession made sense to Rebecca in her body, not just her head. These people had not simply lost money. They had lost the places where their lives had happened. It was, in fact, the same thing that had happened to her. By evening, the light had gone gray and the wind had picked up off the lake, and Rebecca had begun to sort the papers into 3 piles: transfers, with obviously fraudulent supporting documents. Transfers with suspicious but not clearly fraudulent supporting documents. And transfers that could, in charity, be called honest. The first pile was the largest. She wrapped that pile carefully in a clean dish towel, and she set the steel box back inside its own oilcloth, and she went back to the lodge with her arms full. There was a white envelope tucked beneath the front door of the lodge. Rebecca stopped on the porch. The envelope had no stamp, no name. It had been pushed halfway under the door from the outside, as though whoever had left it had wanted her to find it as soon as she stepped inside. She looked around the lodge yard. There was no car. There were no tire tracks besides her own in the wet gravel. Whoever had brought the envelope had been careful. She picked it up. She went inside. She locked the door behind her. She sat at the long dining table with the envelope in front of her for a full minute before she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of good, heavy paper. 3 sentences typed on a computer. No signature. Mrs. Collins, our previous offer remains open. Some histories are painful because they were never meant to be reopened. Rebecca read it 3 times. Then she walked over to the fireplace, where she had been keeping a fire going every evening because the furnace was still, categorically, deceased. She held the letter out over the flames. She thought about it. She lowered her hand. She walked back to the table and folded the letter into thirds. She slipped it into a manila folder along with the copies she had made of the top pages of the steel box documents. 3 months earlier, she would have burned it, because burning it would have felt like closing a door. She had come to understand, in the last week, that closing doors did not always work the way she had believed. In the morning, she drove into town and rented at the small local branch of a bank whose sign was so faded it took her a moment to read. The largest safe deposit box they had. She paid cash for the annual fee. She signed only her name. She placed inside the box every original document she had brought with her from the steel box, along with Margaret's notebook, along with the property agreement from 1987, along with 3 of the photographs from the Collins box. She kept, at the resort, only copies, in a place Michael would never have thought to look, which was the bottom of the flour bin in the lodge kitchen. She was not entirely sure when she had begun to think in those terms, as though she had always kept a small, watchful part of herself waiting for a day like this one, and that part had, finally, been asked to do its work. 2 mornings later, they came back. It was just past 10 when the silver sedan turned into the gravel drive. Richard Hale was in the passenger seat. The driver was a woman in her late 40s, with a leather portfolio in her lap and the calm posture of a person who had ended other people's lives in law offices for money. Rebecca was on the porch when they got out. She did not invite them in. She let them come to her. Richard asked whether they might speak. Rebecca observed that he was already speaking. The woman with the portfolio inclined her head and introduced herself as Allison Byrne, Mr. Hale's attorney. They appreciated her taking the time. Rebecca had not taken anything. Allison Byrne, to her credit, did not react. Richard produced a paper folder from beneath his coat and held it out. Their previous offer had been, in retrospect, unfair. That sounded almost like an apology. Rebecca observed, it wasn't. He told her. He offered the folder again. She took it this time. It was a correction. She opened it in her hands, standing on the porch, without inviting either of them to sit. The top page listed her name, the property description, the parcel number, a line of standard boilerplate, and then, in bold, halfway down the page, the offer, $1,200,000. Rebecca did not react. She read the number twice. She read the terms below it slowly, one line at a time. Ms. Byrne watched her read. For a property, Rebecca observed. That was, in their words, in over her head. For the property as it stood, Ms. Byrne clarified, all structures, all furnishings, all records and documents currently on the premises, all materials discovered on the premises. Rebecca did not lift her eyes from the page. All materials discovered, she repeated. That was standard language. Is it, Miss? Byrne's face did not move. Richard asked whether he might call her Rebecca. No. He laughed once. Short? Then his voice softened. The way a voice softens when a person is about to reach past your defenses on purpose, and she felt her whole body go still. She had had a difficult year. Mrs. Collins, a 22-year marriage, ended. A house she had built with her own hands, sold. A daughter in her second year of college, in a state school that was not going to get any cheaper. Emily, that was her name. Wasn't it? Rebecca did not answer. She should not have to spend the next 20 years of her life fighting a battle she had not started overland, she had not known existed until 3 weeks ago. He was offering her freedom. Mrs. Collins, take it. Rebecca lifted her eyes from the page. How did he know about Emily? Small county, he offered with a smile. No, she told him. That wasn't a small county answer. Allison Byrne, very slightly, shifted her weight. Rebecca closed the folder. She held it out to Richard. He did not take it. She waited. I did not take it. Finally, she set the folder down on the porch railing between them, and she folded her arms across her chest. She'd like them to leave now. Mrs. Collins leave. Richard's expression did not change, but something behind it did. He nodded once to his attorney. They walked back to the sedan without speaking. Rebecca watched them all the way down the drive, and she watched the taillights disappear between the pines, and only then did she pick up the folder from the porch railing and carry it inside. She sat with the offer on the dining table in front of her for a long time. She was not proud, later, of how long she sat. $1.2 million would have paid for Emily's college in cash. It would have bought a small, warm house in a town where the winters were kind. It would have meant never arguing with a plumber again. It would have meant safety. She had spent that afternoon on the phone with her mechanic in Grayling, who had explained, in the patient tone mechanics reserve for women in their 40s driving high-mileage SUVs, that her transmission was not going to last another winter. Then with a contractor from town, who had explained, less patiently, that the lodge roof would need to be replaced, not patched, before the first serious snow, and that the estimate would run into the tens of thousands. The folder on the table felt, in that moment, less like a bribe than a life raft. Emily called that evening. Rebecca sat at the dining table with her phone in her hand and let her daughter's name light up the screen for 4 rings before she answered. She greeted her. Emily thought she sounded weird. Tired, Rebecca offered. Emily observed that she always said that. Rebecca laughed. It was not really a laugh. Emily heard it that way anyway. She wanted to know if her mother was okay. She was working through something. Did she want to talk about it? Rebecca considered it. She could hear, in the background of Emily's line, the sound of a dorm hallway, a girl laughing about something, a door closing. If Emily could erase all the problems in her life with one decision, she asked, would she? Emily was quiet for a moment. That sounded suspiciously like a mom question that was actually about mom. She observed, it might be. Well, Emily took her time answering. She didn't know. She guessed she'd want to know what she'd have to erase along with them. Rebecca closed her eyes. That was the question. Emily wanted to know if she was going to tell her what was going on. Not tonight, Rebecca promised. Soon. Mom. Yeah, whatever it was. Emily told her. Please don't try to protect her from it. She was too old for that now. It just made her feel like her mother didn't trust her. Rebecca sat with the phone against her ear for a moment. She thought about all the small, decent lies of that autumn, and about the way Emily had said, at 20, in the exact tone Rebecca had used with her own mother at 20. She heard her. She was sorry. After they hung up, Rebecca stayed at the table. She looked at the folder. She looked, past it, out the window at the lake, which had turned the color of pewter in the last hour of daylight. She stood up. She walked to cabin 12. She sat at Margaret's little table and set the folder from Allison Byrne on the tabletop and set Margaret's notebook down beside it. 2 futures side by side. One of them made a kind of sense. The other one terrified her. She sat with both of them in front of her for a long time. She opened the notebook again. She let it fall open where it wanted to. It fell open past the last of the tidy entries and into the more hurried ones. A folded photograph, one Rebecca had not fully looked at the first time through, slipped out from between 2 of the pages. She picked it up. Margaret stood on the Silver Pine dock in what looked like the summer of 1988. She was surrounded by 6 older residents, most of them women, all of them looking at her the way people look at someone they believe. Margaret had her arms slightly out at her sides, as if she had just finished saying something and had not yet lowered her hands. Rebecca turned the photograph over. One line, in Margaret's hurried hand. They trusted me because no one else would listen. Rebecca sat with the photograph in her lap for a long time. She thought about her father, not the version of him she had grown up believing, but the version she had begun to understand, in the last few days, must always have existed underneath the first one. A man who had, at some point in his life, chosen silence because he had been afraid, and who had carried that silence into every room of the house he had built for his family, and who had, at some cost she was only beginning to guess at, kept everyone he loved outside of it. She thought about Michael, who had stood in the driveway and told her she was too old to start over. She thought about Emily, at 20, asking her not to be protected. She thought about the sentence on the back of the photograph in her hand. Then she stood up. She left the folder from Allison Byrne on Margaret's table. She took the photograph and the notebook and drove into town in the morning. And she asked the woman at the diner, who knew everyone, whether there was a lawyer in the area who was not entirely afraid of the Hale family. The woman looked at her over a coffee pot for a moment before offering a name. Grace Mercer. Mercer and Reed, 20 miles north. She was about 62. She didn't take anyone's guff, and her office was above the pharmacy in Elmwood. Rebecca would like her. Grace Mercer's office had 2 chairs, a wooden desk, a filing cabinet in the corner that was leaning slightly, and a window that looked out over the alley behind the pharmacy. Grace herself was a compact woman with steel-colored hair, sharp brown eyes, and half-glasses hung around her neck on a chain not unlike Dorothy's. She listened to Rebecca for nearly an hour without interrupting. Rebecca had brought copies of everything. When Rebecca finally stopped talking, Grace took off her half-glasses, set them on the desk, and rubbed the bridge of her nose with 2 fingers. If these documents were authentic, she told her, some of this was serious. Could Richard Hale take Silver Pine from her? Rebecca wanted to know. Not because he wanted it. No. Could he bury this? Grace looked up at her. He could try. Would he succeed? Grace considered. That depended, she said, on whether Rebecca was prepared for a slow fight. Not a dramatic one. There wasn't going to be a courtroom scene. There wasn't going to be a moment when a judge banged a gavel and someone was let out in handcuffs. Not with these people. What there might be, if she was patient, was a slow, quiet reopening of some old land claims that a certain family in Grand Rapids would very much prefer stayed closed. That was what this looked like. If it looked like anything, Rebecca folded her hands in her lap. They were shaking, slightly. She had not noticed. She didn't want revenge. Miss Mercer. Good. She didn't want to destroy anyone. Also good. She just didn't want to be bought. Grace studied her over the desk for a long moment. Then she picked up her half-glasses and put them back on. Then don't be, she offered. It sounded simple. It was not simple. But Rebecca thanked her, and she left. And she drove back to Silver Pine with the manila folder still on her passenger seat. And she parked at the lodge and walked directly out to the end of the broken dock without going inside first. She stood at the end of the dock in the cold late afternoon light and took Allison Byrne's contract out of the folder and held it in both hands. For one dangerous second, she imagined signing it. She saw the small house in the warm town, Emily's tuition paid, the plumber's envelope stopping. She saw the version of herself who would still be alive in 20 years, sitting in a lawn chair with a paperback, having chosen safety. Not a bad version, just a version who had walked away. Rebecca tore the signature page in half, not dramatically, not angrily, just once, cleanly, straight down the middle. The 2 halves fluttered in the wind off the lake. She folded them together and slid them back inside the folder, because she was not, apparently, a person who littered even at moments of personal decision. For 22 years, she had built her security around a husband. When that had ended, she had tried, for 3 months, to build it around the walls of a house. Neither had held. What she understood, standing at the end of the dock, was something quieter and harder. Security was not always the possession of things no one could take from you. Sometimes it was the knowledge of who you would be if they did. Behind her stood a leaking lodge, a broken dock, 11 cabins in various states of decay, and one hidden cabin with a trap door in the floor. For the first time, Rebecca did not see ruins. She saw possibilities. She turned and walked back up the length of the dock toward the lodge, and she whispered, to no one in particular, the sentence Michael had once made sound impossible. I'm starting over. And this time, she believed herself. By early November, the roof leaked in 3 places when it rained and in only 1 when it snowed. And Rebecca had accepted that this was, in the short term, going to have to count as progress. She woke every morning at 6. She made coffee in the white mug on the camp stove because the wiring in the lodge kitchen was still, according to a red-nosed electrician named Vern, best described as inadvisable. She ate oatmeal standing up. She pulled on the pair of thick canvas work gloves Michael had bought for himself the summer he had built the deck on the Michigan house, 10 years ago, and never used more than twice. They were the only thing of his she had decided, in the last month, was actually useful. They fit her hands almost perfectly, which she had, at first, been irritated by, and then had decided to interpret as evidence that if she had wanted to, she could always have used those gloves herself. She patched a corner of drywall in the manager's cottage using a video she watched twice on her phone. She caulked a window. She scraped decades of pine sap off the porch of cabin 4. She learned that the correct way to unscrew a rusted bolt was, apparently, to hit it with a hammer first, which she had not previously known and was, having discovered it, unreasonably proud of. She made mistakes. She wasted a whole afternoon trying to reset a breaker in a panel that turned out to belong to a well pump that no longer existed. She burned a batch of homemade biscuits. She stripped the head off a Phillips screw with a flathead driver and had to drill the screw out with a bit she borrowed from Vern's cousin's brother-in-law, who owned the hardware store in Birch Hollow and was, it turned out, a distant nephew of Dorothy Walsh. She got, along the way, an education in local kindness. The hardware store nephew, whose name was Cal, refused to charge her for the bit. When she tried to pay anyway, he waved her off and told her that the way she paid him was by keeping the resort going. A woman named Ruth from the diner brought her a casserole on the day of the first hard freeze. A retired welder named Doug knocked on the lodge door one afternoon and asked, without preamble, whether she wanted him to fix the boiler in the basement in exchange for the right to use her North Beach for ice fishing in January. Rebecca agreed on the spot. Doug fixed the boiler that same afternoon and refused a cup of coffee at the end of it. Because, he explained, his wife had opinions about how much coffee he drank in a day, and he was, in his own words, a man who tried to stay married. Rebecca laughed. She had begun, that autumn, to laugh at things again. Every evening, when she washed her hands at the kitchen sink, she looked at them and understood, quietly and without ceremony, that these were the hands of a woman who was going to live in this place. Grace Mercer called on the second Wednesday of November. She had been going through what Rebecca had given her. She reported, it was going to take longer than she had hoped. How much longer? Rebecca wanted to know. That depended, Grace explained, on which companies had dissolved before or after the transfers. Some of the corporate paperwork was missing from the state records, which was not, in itself, damning, but was not, in itself, encouraging either. Rebecca asked whether Grace was saying they might not get anywhere. Grace was quiet for a beat. She was saying, Mrs. Collins, that truth doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it takes years just to get someone to listen. If Rebecca had been expecting a courthouse scene, she should correct that expectation now, before it became a disappointment later. Rebecca stood in the drafty lodge kitchen with the phone against her ear. She hadn't been expecting one. She promised. Good. Grace, yes. Keep going. Grace went. Rebecca hung up. She stood at the sink for a long time before she went back to the drywall. 12 days later, Grace called again and told her she needed to come to her office. Now, Rebecca asked. When she could, Grace corrected. Not tomorrow. Sooner. Rebecca drove the 20 miles to Elmwood in a heavy sleet. The wipers on her SUV had begun to complain in a way she was going to have to address before Christmas, and the transmission had begun to make a small, hesitant sound whenever she went above 60. And she thought about how, 6 months ago, Either of those things would have prompted a tearful phone call to Michael. Neither of them prompted anything now. She would deal with the SUV when she could, or she would not. Or she would find a used truck at a lot in Birch Hollow, whose owner had known Dorothy's late husband, and would, Dorothy had implied, give a fair price to any Collins. Grace was waiting for her at the top of the pharmacy stairs. On Grace's desk sat a small, battered cardboard box, tied with twine. An attorney named Marvin Halloran had represented Silver Pine in the late 80s and early 90s. Grace explained. His practice had closed after his son had died. His widow had sold the office building to a chiropractor last month. In the course of the clean-out, she had found this in the back of a filing closet. She had called the county bar. The county bar had called Grace, because Grace had asked to be called if anything of the sort ever surfaced. Rebecca looked at the box. It was her father's, Grace told her. Rebecca sat down. Grace turned the box so it faced Rebecca. Then she stepped back and busied herself, with intentional visibility, at the filing cabinet in the corner. The kindness of it was not lost on Rebecca. Grace was making it clear, without saying so, that whatever was in the box was Rebecca's to read at her own pace and in her own privacy, and that a lawyer's office did not need to become a room where a daughter learned about her father under a lawyer's gaze. Rebecca untied the twine. Inside was a small stack of envelopes, perhaps 11 or 12, all addressed, in her father's handwriting, to Marvin Halloran, attorney at law, Elmwood, Michigan, all postmarked between October of 1989 and the spring of 1991. All, upon inspection, opened. Most contained 1 or 2 pages of typed correspondence and a handwritten note clipped to the top. Rebecca picked up the topmost envelope. October 4th, 1989. She unfolded the pages inside. The typed portion was legal boilerplate, an acknowledgement of receipt, a record of instructions. It did not interest her. She set it aside and read the handwritten note. I should have stayed with Margaret. That was the whole note. One sentence. In the handwriting she had been signing birthday cards next to for most of her childhood. Rebecca sat with it for a long moment. She read the sentence twice. She turned the note over. There was nothing else. She set it, very carefully, on Grace's desk, and she picked up the next envelope. The second letter was longer. It was dated December of 1989, and it detailed, in her father's small, precise voice, what he believed had happened to his sister. Margaret had been in the middle of collecting statements from elderly residents. She had asked her brother to help her carry copies out of the county in case something happened. He had refused. He had told her she was making a mountain out of a molehill. He had told her that some things did not have to be Margaret's business just because Margaret had, for whatever reason, decided they had argued. He had driven back to Muskegon. 2 weeks later, Margaret was gone. A story had circulated about a boyfriend in Sudbury. Thomas Collins had known there was no boyfriend in Sudbury. Thomas Collins had, in the letter to Marvin Halloran, admitted plainly that he had been too frightened to say so out loud. He had a young wife. He had a mortgage. He had a job at the ball-bearing plant in Muskegon that would not have survived any kind of trouble. He had told his parents to never speak her name in their house again. He had written, near the bottom of the second page, he had been a coward. Marvin. He did not know how to stop being one. He had hired the attorney because he had not known who else to hire. He was asking him to keep the letters. If anything ever came of it, he had his permission to open them. Rebecca sat. Outside, the sleet had turned to snow. Grace, from the corner of the office, did not turn around. Rebecca kept reading. The letters, taken in order, described a man learning, slowly and at some cost to himself, to hold on to a truth he had once been too afraid to speak. He never went back to the North Country. He carried Margaret's name in his mouth like a stone he could not swallow. He wrote to Marvin Halloran every year or two, without warning, to update his address, to note the birth of his daughter, to say that he had not forgotten. He asked Halloran once whether it would be safe to try to talk. Halloran, in a note clipped to that letter, had counseled him against it. The Hale family was still active in the region. There was, Halloran wrote, no legal statute of limitations on land fraud, but there were practical limitations on what an elderly private attorney and a frightened Muskegon father could accomplish against a well-lawyered adversary. Halloran had suggested, in his careful backhand, that the moment might come, and that when it did, they would be ready. Rebecca picked up this last envelope in the box. It was dated 8 years ago. She recognized the paper. It was the letterhead her father had used for the small chess club newsletter he had edited in his retirement. His hand had begun, by then, to shake in the way that would eventually become the diagnosis they had all learned to say the word for. His letters leaned a little more heavily than they used to, but the sentence at the bottom of the page was clear. If Silver Pine ever comes up for foreclosure, notify me. Below it, in an even smaller hand, added later if I am gone, notify Rebecca Collins. Rebecca closed her eyes. She saw, very clearly, herself at 2 in the morning in Francis's rented room, sitting on the edge of a twin bed with a laptop on her knees. She saw the real estate listing appearing on her screen as though at random, in the middle of a scroll through cabins in Wisconsin and trailers in Traverse City. She saw the price. She saw her own hand clicking. She saw the woman she had believed herself to be that night, a woman making a rash and lonely decision to prove a man wrong, spending her last dollars on a place she had never been. She had not been that woman, or more accurately, she had been that woman and something else too. She had been the endpoint of a phone call her father had asked to be made 40 years after he had first been too afraid to make it himself. Marvin Halloran had died a widower. His son had died. His practice had closed. His widow had cleaned out a filing cabinet. Somewhere in that chain of ordinary sad events, a note had been passed, not by Halloran, by whoever had inherited his firm's contact list and had, out of long habit or professional duty, kept an eye out for the name Silver Pine on the county foreclosure roll. The listing had gone up, a quiet call had been made, a quiet email had been sent, and a woman named Rebecca Collins, at 2 in the morning in a rented room in southern Michigan, had scrolled past a listing that had been placed, in some sense, exactly in front of her. She opened her eyes. Grace was back at her desk. She had set a mug of hot water and a tea bag in front of Rebecca without asking. Rebecca noticed the mug for the first time. He had wanted her to find it, she told Grace. Grace considered the answer for a moment. She thought, she offered, that he had wanted someone to have the courage he didn't. That hurt more than Rebecca had expected. For most of her childhood, and all of her adult life, she had carried the memory of her father as a strong man. He had fixed things. He had paid bills on time. He had known how to check the oil in her car. He had not cried at his own mother's funeral. In the version of him she had built and lived in, he had been the sort of man who did not, ever, look away. The version on Grace's desk was smaller and more human, and, she found, easier to love. She had spent 22 years afraid. Afraid of conflict, afraid of being alone, afraid that if Michael ever stopped choosing her, there would be nothing beneath her but the fact of not having been chosen. Her father had done what he could with fear. She had done what she could with fear. Neither of them had been proud of it. Maybe that was the whole point. Maybe courage was not something you either had or didn't have. Maybe it was something one generation ran from so the next generation could finally turn around and look. Rebecca thanked Grace. She took the box. She drove back to Silver Pine through the snow, and she did not, on the way, cry, because the wipers were bad enough already without adding to their workload. Emily was waiting on the lodge porch. Rebecca braked in the middle of the gravel drive. She saw the little red hatchback she had co-signed for Emily's 16th birthday parked next to the maintenance shed. Emily was in her old high school hoodie, sitting on the top step, drinking from a thermos. Rebecca parked. She walked up the path. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. What was she doing here? Emily had thought her mother had sounded weird on the phone last week. She always sounded weird on the phone. She had sounded weirder. Rebecca laughed once, breathless. She climbed the steps. Emily stood up and set the thermos down on the porch railing and opened her arms. Rebecca fell into them. Not the careful hug she had been giving people since the divorce. The kind that touched only the outer shell of another person. A real hug. A hug with the whole weight of her against her daughter's shoulder. And once she was there, once her face was pressed against the fabric of the hoodie, once she was in the smell of her daughter's shampoo and her daughter's dryer sheets, and the particular way her daughter's neck had always smelled since she was 3 months old, Rebecca began to cry. She had not cried in front of Emily since the day Michael had left. She had also not, until this moment, understood how much of an accomplishment that had been, or how expensive. They stood on the porch for a long time. Emily did not shush her. Emily did not pat her. Emily simply held on and let her mother cry in the way you let a person cry when you have finally, gently, understood that the person has been carrying something they were not supposed to carry alone. At some point, Rebecca realized she was going to have to breathe eventually. And to breathe, she was going to have to speak. She spoke into the hoodie. She had thought Grandpa had sent her here. What? Emily wanted to know. Come inside. They sat in the lodge dining room. In front of the fire, Rebecca had learned to build the night the furnace died. Rebecca made 2 cups of coffee, since Emily had been driving since dawn, and Emily wrapped both hands around her cup and did not drink from it. She listened to her mother the way people listen to a doctor giving news. Rebecca told her everything. Silver Pine, the postcard, the count, cabin 12, the trap door, the Collins box, Margaret, the notebook, Dorothy, the old dock and the steel box, Allison Byrne and the $1,200,000 offer, Grace Mercer, the letters, her father, afraid, her father, waiting, her father, finally doing the only thing he had felt strong enough to do, which was to put her name on a note in a lawyer's file. Emily listened without interrupting. When Rebecca finished, Emily was quiet for a long time. She was. Rebecca realized, thinking, not reacting, not performing sympathy, thinking. Somewhere in the last 2 years, Emily had become a person who thought before she answered, and Rebecca did not know exactly when that had happened, but she was very glad it had. Then Emily offered that maybe Grandpa hadn't sent her here to fix his mistake. Rebecca looked at her. Maybe he had just known she was the one person who wouldn't look away. Rebecca laughed through the last of her tears. Emily had a very generous opinion of her mother. She had an accurate one. They stayed like that, both of them looking at the fire, for a long time. Later, after Emily had gone to unpack her overnight bag in the cabin next to the lodge, which Rebecca had been keeping halfway habitable for exactly the purpose of, one day, a daughter arriving, Rebecca went into the kitchen to make tea. She reached, without thinking, into the shoebox on the counter where she still kept the 2 mugs. Her hand touched the blue one. She stopped. She stood there for a long moment with her fingers curled around the handle of Michael's mug. She thought about the woman who had wrapped it in a dish towel 3 months ago in Francis's rented kitchen because her hand had not been able to leave it behind. She thought about the woman who had held it up in the pale October light in the parking lot at Silver Pine and told nobody that one was enough now. She thought about how a mug, in the end, was a mug. It was ceramic. It held liquid. It did not, on its own, belong to anyone. It certainly did not belong to a man who no longer lived in a house where she also lived. She had spent, she realized, 3 months carrying a small piece of pottery around because part of her had believed, without ever quite admitting it, that if she kept the mug, the marriage would still be able to come back for it. It was not going to come back for it. It had not been going to come back for it in October, and it was not going to come back for it now. And the mug did not know any of this, because the mug was a mug. She carried it outside. She did not smash it against a rock. She did not deliver an angry monologue. She did not take a photograph of herself doing anything symbolic with it. She walked around to the back of the lodge, where she had set up a large cardboard box for the church rummage sale that Dorothy had mentioned was coming up in Birch Hollow, and she set the blue mug inside the box. Emily was standing in the doorway when Rebecca came back into the kitchen. Emily looked at her mother's empty hand and asked whether she was sure. Rebecca considered. Someone might need a coffee mug. Emily nodded. Once. She did not smile in the pleased proprietary way children sometimes smile when their parents finally do the thing the children have been silently hoping their parents would do. She just nodded. That, in Rebecca's opinion, was very kind. Rebecca made 2 cups of tea. There was, she noticed, plenty of room in the shoebox now for the white mug. It stood by itself in the middle of the box, in its own generous space, and Rebecca thought, absurdly, that it looked slightly relieved. Emily left the following afternoon. She hugged her mother again on the lodge porch. She promised to come back at Thanksgiving. She asked her to please answer her phone. She told her she loved her. She got in her red hatchback and drove away, and Rebecca stood on the porch and watched the little car disappear between the pines. And then she went back inside and made herself a fresh cup of tea in the white mug and sat down at the dining table with a legal pad and a pen. She was not sure, at first, what she was writing. She began by listing the things Silver Pine could someday become. A repaired lodge, obviously. Cabins ready for paying guests. A small dining program in the summer months. If she could hire a cook, someone to do the linens, maintenance help, local carpenters, a dock people could swim off, perhaps a canoe rental. If she could find a canoe with all its pieces, a morning workshop program, maybe, someday, for retirees who wanted to learn how to fix small engines or paint watercolors or, God help her, write memoirs. The list ran on for pages. Rebecca was surprised, mildly, by how many things she had, apparently, been thinking about without knowing she was thinking about them. Then, halfway down the second page, she wrote something she had not planned: 3 cabins reserved for women starting over after 45. She stared at the sentence. She thought of the woman she had been in Francis's rented room, who had eaten cold soup out of a can with a plastic spoon because it had felt beneath her. Somehow, to buy real food she would then be too tired to make. She thought of a friend from Michigan who had been widowed at 51 and had lost her house to a set of medical bills 2 years later. She thought of a woman she had once seen at a state park bathroom in southern Michigan, brushing her teeth at the sink at 7 in the morning with a suitcase leaning against the wall behind her, and about how she, Rebecca, had washed her hands quickly and walked out without meeting the woman's eyes because she had not, then, been the kind of person who knew what to do with the sight. She thought about how, at 47, she had believed she was the only person carrying what she was carrying, and about how comprehensively wrong she had been. She thought about the women she had already met, in her 47 years, who had come to some late point in their own lives and found that the country did not have very many good places to put a woman who was, through no particular fault of her own, at the wrong intersection of age and money and marital status all at once. Sisters, neighbors, co-workers. A high school friend named Diane who now, at 53, slept in her grown son's guest room and told everyone at Thanksgiving that she was on a sabbatical. She circled the sentence twice. Above it, in the margin, she wrote a name. Second season. Rebecca sat with the pen in her hand for a long time after that. She looked out the window at the lake. Michael had told her, on the last day she had lived under his roof, that she was 47 and could not just start over. He had been right. In one sense, she had not, in the end, started over. Starting over would have meant returning to some earlier version of herself, some smaller Rebecca who had not yet been left. That woman was gone. She had never been particularly available in the first place. What Rebecca had done, and what she was going to keep doing, was different. She had started from everything life had already taught her: her scars, her mother's quilt, the years she had spent being smaller than she was, Emily, the single true useful thing Michael had ever bought and never used, which was a pair of canvas gloves, a father who had, in the end, done what he could, an aunt she had never met, whose name was going to hang on a small brass plaque above a cabin door before another summer had passed. The life she built next was going to belong to her. By March, Vern and his cousin's brother-in-law's crew had begun on the lodge roof. By April, the plumbing in cabins 1 through 7 had been walked through by a licensed plumber Rebecca had, by then, come to think of as a friend. By May, the dock had been rebuilt in cedar and pressure-treated pine by a 2-man team from Elmwood. Rebecca, who had once cried in a rented room at the thought of having to negotiate with a hardware store, learned to negotiate with contractors. She learned to walk a job. She learned when to say yes and when to ask for time to think about a thing and when to explain, politely, that something was not going to work for her. She got, some days, worse at being polite. She got, most days, better at being honest. Grace's investigation moved the way Grace had promised it would move. Slowly, quietly, without cameras. A lawyer in Grand Rapids named Elizabeth Farrow joined Grace's efforts and turned out to be, in Grace's words, Exactly the kind of woman a certain family did not want to see on the other side of a deposition table. In late April, an elderly man from a lakeshore family Rebecca had never met sat down in Grace's office with his adult son and reopened, formally, a land claim his own parents had abandoned in 1984 after signing a document that his lawyer, on reviewing the documents Rebecca had provided, called, with unusual heat for a member of the county bar, an act of legal fiction. Richard Hale did not go to jail. Nobody was let out of a courtroom in handcuffs. A judge did not. As Grace had accurately predicted, bang any gavels. What happened instead was that certain quiet arrangements began, one by one, to come apart. A settlement was reached in one case. Then in a second, a parcel of shoreline was returned to a family. Then another. Allison Burns stopped returning Grace's calls, which Grace took as a compliment. For Rebecca, that was enough. Margaret had spent the last 3 summers of her life trying, mostly alone, to get somebody to listen. Now somebody had. Perfect justice was not on offer at that price point. Rebecca understood. She kept cabin 12 closed to guests. She cleaned it thoroughly, once, with a soft brush and a bucket of warm water and lemon oil, on a Sunday morning in April. She washed the coffee cup with the red flower rim and set it back on the table. She took the wool coat down from the hook, aired it, brushed it, and put it back on the hook. She left the clock at 2:17. She rehung the photographs from Margaret's box behind glass along the west wall, so a person walking through the small room could see the faces the way Rebecca had first seen them, alone in a beam of flashlight. She placed the notebook in a shallow oak display case Vern's brother-in-law's cousin had built for her at cost. She had a small brass plaque made, and she screwed it into the wall beside the door with her own drill, without help. On a Wednesday afternoon in May, Margaret Collins. She refused to look away. Rebecca stepped back and looked at it for a long time when she was done. Silver Pine reopened on a warm Saturday in June. There were folding tables on the lawn, paper plates. A pair of local musicians who had played every wedding in the county for 30 years stood beneath the pines with a guitar and a mandolin. Children ran along the shoreline in the reckless, barefoot manner of children at any lake in any June. Rebecca had, on Dorothy's insistence, invited every family in Birch Hollow who had ever set foot at Silver Pine in the years before it closed, and about a third of them had come. She had also invited, on Grace's suggestion, the 2 families whose lakefront claims had been reopened. Both families had come. One of them had brought a plate of homemade danishes. Rebecca stood on the lodge porch and watched. She had done it. Mom. Rebecca turned. Emily was standing on the porch beside her, sunburned already, holding a lemonade in a plastic cup. Rebecca laughed. She had done some of it. She corrected her daughter. A lot of people had done most of it. Sure, but she had started it. She had done that. Emily slipped her arm through her mother's. They walked together down the lawn and out along the new cedar dock. The lake was the color of a hammered coin under the afternoon sun. Rebecca could smell mown grass and lake water and, faintly, whatever the guitar player was smoking beneath the pines. At the end of the dock, they stopped. They stood there for a while without speaking. Emily was watching a pair of loons at the far side of the lake. Rebecca was watching Emily. Mom. Yes. Did she ever think about Dad? Rebecca considered. Sometimes. She allowed. Did she miss him? 6 months ago. That question would have broken something in her. It broke nothing now. Rebecca thought about it honestly, the way she had learned to think about most things honestly. On the drive down from Marvin Halloran's box, on the nights she had sat by the fire with Margaret's notebook in her lap, on the mornings when her hands had built a fire without asking. She missed who they had been, sometimes, or who she had thought they had been. Emily nodded. But she did not miss the woman she had become trying to keep it together. Emily leaned her head against Rebecca's shoulder. Had she ever thought Dad leaving would bring her here? Rebecca smiled sadly. No, but she was glad she was here. She was. Emily looked out over the water for a moment. She had thought losing Michael meant she had lost her life. Rebecca offered quietly. It had taken her a long time to understand she had only lost the life she had built around him. Emily said nothing. She squeezed her mother's arm. Behind them, someone at the folding tables laughed at something, and one of the loons on the far side of the lake called, and Rebecca stood on her own new dock with her daughter's head against her shoulder and understood, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not waiting for her life to begin. She was standing in it. Behind them, someone called Rebecca's name. Rebecca turned. A woman had gotten out of an older sedan parked crookedly at the far end of the gravel lot. She was perhaps 60, gray hair cropped short, a canvas jacket over a plaid button-down. She had two suitcases at her feet, one hard-sided and old, one softer and newer, and she was standing beside them the way a person stands beside luggage when she is not entirely sure the luggage is welcome to stay. Rebecca knew, without having to be told, who she was. That was the first second-season resident, she told Emily. Emily looked at the woman. She was early. Emily thought her mother should go. Rebecca kissed the top of her daughter's head. She walked back up the dock and across the lawn. She passed a table where an elderly woman was holding forth about a chowder recipe. She passed the musicians. She reached the gravel lot. The woman by the suitcases looked at her nervously and began to apologize. She knew she was early. She got confused about the time zone thing. She didn't know why. She had lived in Michigan her whole life. She could come back. She was fine. Was she sure because she was fine? What was her name? Linda. Linda Harper. Rebecca Collins. Rebecca offered and held out her hand. Linda hesitated, then shook it. Her palm was cold and her grip was uncertain. The grip of a woman who had, in recent months, stopped being certain of most things. She had never done anything like this. Linda admitted, neither had Rebecca. 6 months ago. She didn't really know what she was supposed to do next. Rebecca considered her. Linda Harper was. Rebecca had learned from the application forms. 60 years old. She had been widowed a year and a half ago. Her husband had been a high school biology teacher in a small town outside Kalamazoo, and he had, according to the letter Linda had written on lined notebook paper, gone quickly and without warning at his desk during his lunch break in February of the previous year. Linda had held on for a year through the medical bills and the sale of the second car and the switch to a smaller heating plan. Then the apartment complex where she had lived for 12 years had been bought by an out-of-state company, and the rent had been raised in a way that made no allowance for a widow who had budgeted for 12 years around the older rent. Linda had a sister in Grand Rapids who could take her in for 6 weeks, and no plan after that. Silver Pine had been that plan. Rebecca had seen, in the last 4 months, the version of herself who had sat in Francis's rented kitchen eating cold soup with a plastic spoon. She did not need to see her again in the parking lot at her own resort. She reached down and picked up the hard-sided suitcase. It was heavier than she had expected. She told Linda she didn't have to know tonight. To come inside, she had time to figure it out. Linda stared at her. Something in her face, some tightness that Rebecca recognized because she had worn its close cousin all through the previous winter, softened. All right, Linda offered quietly. Rebecca smiled. Cabin 3, she told her. The middle one. She had painted the door blue because she could not find the color the paint company had said it was. If she did not like blue, they could change it. Blue was fine. They walked together down the path toward the 3 cabins along the eastern shore that Rebecca had, that morning, hung small brass signs on. Second season. Linda did not ask. On the walk. What second season meant. Rebecca did not explain it. She was going to have plenty of time, in the coming weeks, to explain it to Linda in the way it deserved to be explained, which was not in a hurry. They reached cabin 3. Rebecca opened the door. She set the hard-sided suitcase inside on the little braided rug she had bought at an estate sale in Elmwood the week before. Linda followed her in with the softer bag. There was tea in the cupboard, Rebecca told her. Coffee, too, if she was a coffee person. A fresh loaf of bread on the counter from the diner in town. Dorothy had dropped it off that morning. The heat was temperamental. She should wear socks. Wear socks, Linda repeated, and something that was not quite a laugh caught in her throat. Rebecca had picked that up from a landlady last October. Linda thought she might steal it. Please do. Rebecca stood in the doorway for a moment. Linda had set her suitcase on the small bed and was standing beside it with her hands loose at her sides. And Rebecca understood that Linda was, in that moment, in a small quiet room with a lake outside, having her first minute in a very long time when nobody was measuring her for anything. Rebecca thought about how much she had needed exactly that minute, in October, when she had unlocked the door of the lodge and stood in it, and how she had needed it more, in some ways, than she had needed food or heat or a working furnace. "Take her time," Rebecca offered. She stepped out onto the porch of cabin 3 and closed the door softly behind her. Later, after the last of the guests had gone home, and the folding tables had been folded, and the musicians had been paid, and Emily had helped her clean the lodge kitchen and had, at last, gone to bed in the little upstairs room Rebecca had set up for her, and the lake had gone silver in the last of the twilight. Rebecca walked out alone toward cabin 12. She sat in Margaret's chair. On the table in front of her was the last photograph from the Collins box, the one she had never quite gotten around to putting behind glass with the others. Margaret and Thomas on the dock. August 1988. Late summer. Her father's arm around his sister's waist. Her aunt's chin lifted in that easy way, both of them looking straight at the camera. Rebecca had seen this photograph a dozen times. She had never turned it over in her lamp's direct light. She picked it up now. She reached for the small brass lamp on the table beside her and clicked it on. She held the photograph close. There was writing on the back. She had known there was writing on the back. Thomas and Margaret Collins, August 1988, in Margaret's careful hand, exactly as it had been on the front-facing card in the box on the day she had found it. She had glanced at that and set the photograph aside. What she had not seen, until now, in the direct light of this small lamp, was another line, written beneath the date, in ink that had faded so far into the yellow-brown of the aging photograph paper that it looked, at first, like a stain. She held it closer. The handwriting was not Margaret's. The handwriting was her father's. She read the sentence. "If Rebecca ever finds this place, tell her I'm sorry I couldn't come back myself." Rebecca covered her mouth with her hand. She sat like that in Margaret's chair for a long time, not moving, holding the photograph in her lap. She thought of her father, in his last few years, walking into Marvin Halloran's small paneled office in Elmwood on some errand nobody in the family had known about, sitting across from a lawyer he had trusted for decades, sliding this one photograph across a desk with a single sentence written on the back. She thought of him deciding, with what she now understood must have cost him something enormous, that his daughter should be told this small thing by someone else, later, because he had not been able to say it himself. She thought of the years he had spent, in his quiet retirement, editing a chess club newsletter and mowing his own small lawn and going to church on Sundays, holding, all that time, this one sentence back for her. She thought of Margaret, standing on the dock with her arm around her younger brother, at the peak of a summer neither of them had known was going to be the last of anything. She cried, not for very long, not the racking kind of crying she had done on Emily's shoulder in November. A quieter kind. The kind of crying a person does when the last stone in a load she has been carrying without knowing she was carrying it is, at last, gently set down beside her by someone else. She sat with the photograph for a while after the tears stopped. She turned it face up on the table and looked at her aunt's face in the little cone of lamplight. Margaret's chin, lifted in that way, her father's arm around his sister's waist, boyish and unguarded. Somewhere in the frame of that image was every wrong thing that had happened at Silver Pine, and every right thing, and the reason both of those things belonged, in the end, to the same story. Rebecca did not entirely understand it yet. She thought she would spend some part of the rest of her life understanding it. That was all right. She had, at some point in the last year, become a woman who could tolerate not fully understanding a thing. Eventually she smiled through the last of it. She set the photograph back on the table. She turned off the lamp. She sat in the dark for another minute or two, listening to the lake and to the small night sounds of a resort that had, at last, people sleeping in some of its cabins again. Then she stood up. She walked out of cabin 12. She closed the door softly. She walked down the pine trail, the same trail she had, in October, half-clawed her way along with a postcard folded against her ribs, and which was now, in June, cleared and marked and easy to see. She reached the lodge. She climbed the porch steps. She stood there for a moment. Silver Pine's lights burned across the dark water. Somewhere in the lodge behind her, Emily was asleep in the upstairs room. In cabin 3, along the eastern shore, a 60-year-old widow was, Rebecca hoped, unpacking a soft suitcase and hanging a canvas jacket on a hook, and understanding, slowly, that she did not have to know tonight. In cabin 12, at the north end of the trail, a small brass plaque bore the name of a woman who had, 40 years ago, refused to look away, and whose refusal had, at last, reached the person she had never gotten the chance to meet. Rebecca stepped onto the porch. She thought, without quite meaning to, of the woman she had been on the day she had first arrived, in October, standing in the pale October light beside her SUV with 2 coffee mugs wrapped in dish towels on the passenger seat. That woman had come north to disappear. She had believed she had bought Silver Pine because she needed a place where nobody would find her. She would have said, if someone had asked her, that her real life had ended in a kitchen in southern Michigan and that what was left was a kind of long, polite waiting. That woman had been wrong. Michael had told her, on the last day she had lived in his house, that she was 47 and could not just start over. She understood, now that he had been right. She had not started over. Starting over would have been going back to the beginning. She was not the woman she had been at 25. She had scars now. She had a daughter she loved. She had an aunt whose name she was going to carry into every summer at Silver Pine for as long as she owned it. She had a father she had, at last, forgiven. She had the knowledge of what she would be if everything were taken from her, which she had, in the end, discovered by having enough taken from her to find out. She had not started over. She had done something better. She had moved forward. Rebecca Collins stood on the porch of her lodge and looked out across her lake, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid of what came next. She was